Thank you.
Did you make it?
Last night.
Last night?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Can I taste?
Please.
No. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Last night. Yeah. I have some ginger. I'm serving it with ginger later.
All right.
Pretty good? Okay, good.
Are excited now. So we can say welcome.
So I get my coaching from you guys?
Stink Fest. Annual.
All right.
It's going to get really stinky in here. But before that, we're going to have a talk by David Zilber from the, world's most famous restaurant, Noma. I don't have to explain that right now. I am going to read his bio. But I do want to say that the organizers of this festival are me, and Claudia, and Heidi. The founders, I think another one is here. I'm one of them, but we just want to thank you for supporting this festival. It's volunteer run. It's a labor of love, and it's super creative and fun. And we love that we've always had it be a no sales event, so that you show up and you engage and you talk to one another, you skill share, you learn a lot, and you're not being sold to, and it's not a consumer-driven event. So tonight you'll sample all sorts of fermented foods and drinks from the makers themselves. So have so much fun. Thank you for coming. And let's all raise our sample cups. Does everyone have them? Did everyone get? Does everyone back there have them? So maybe we'll have the toast be stay stinky. Okay? So on the count of 3, we'll say stay stinky. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Stay stinky! Put your arms down now. Woo! That's smelly. Okay.
Thank you, Matt.
Okay, so really quickly, so that we can move on to David, I'm going to read his bio. David Zilber is a chef and photographer who hails from Toronto, Canada. He has cooked from coast to coast across North America, most notably as a sous chef at Hawksworth Restaurant in Vancouver. He's worked at Noma since 2014 and has served as director of its fermentation lab since 2016. Zilber is the co-author with Renee Redzepi of the New York Times bestseller, The Noma Guide to Fermentation, which some of you have already purchased, but after the talk you can purchase the book outside from Broadway Books. We'll have a line that kind of snakes around, and he signed them and can personalize them. David also, I just wanted to add, enjoys Jamaican patties. Yeah. And quantum physics, and you can find him on Instagram at David_Zilber. And then I just want to quickly read something from our festival king, who is Sandor Katz. He helped us kick off this festival 10 years ago. He's a huge inspiration to, I think, a lot of people in the room, including myself. And he says, Renee Redzepi and the Noma team bring extraordinary creativity to the ancient and universal practice of fermentation. Accessible enough for novices, the Noma Guide to Fermentation is sure to elevate the practices of those of us already enchanted with the vast realm of fermentation. And without further ado, let's all raise our hands for David Zilber.
here at the Portland Fermentation Festival. It is really amazing to see everyone and you know, get a sniff and a taste of all the wares on display, and really experience the power of a culture. And I will use that word tonight with double entendre in more than one sense, because that's what fermentation is. It is culture. It is culture at the microscopic level, and it is culture at the macroscopic level. And this talk will probably lean into some philosophical ramifications of the practice, but it is really an enchanting world and an enchanting practice. Like Sandor says, it's a completely all-encompassing and all-consuming thing to do once you start to wrap your head around it. I asked a couple people what I should talk about up here before we got started, and some people actually want to hear my story, so I'll give you a bit of that, and it's a good place to start because my story is as plain as anybody's when it comes to the fact that I wasn't fermenting, and then all of a sudden I was, and now I can never imagine not fermenting. Right? Yeah, I think so. But I've been a chef for 15 years. I got my start in Toronto. I was extremely bad at school. I was clever, but I was apathetic, and like a lot of teenagers. And I didn't think I was getting into university. My grades were so poor. And I had guidance counselors suggested, they're like, oh, well, you know, we saw you bake cakes for your friends' birthdays, and I've tasted them, and they're pretty good. Do you like cooking? And I'm like, yeah, I like cooking. Like, well, why don't you turn that into a profession? And so that's what I did. And I attended an apprenticeship program for my last year of high school, and it was all of a sudden a very different mode of learning. All of a sudden, working in a kitchen made a lot more sense than having to read a book and to memorize equations and be quizzed on a test. All of a sudden, I was learning in a very hands-on way, in a way that mattered. And you could see results, and you had very clear directions and clear instructions. And for whatever reason, you know, all the cogs kind of lined up in place in a kitchen. And so I did that from, you know, 18 years old onward. I cooked in Toronto, and then moved to Vancouver. And an old chef instructor of mine once said, "Have knives will travel," and it's very true. It's very easy for a cook to pick up and go and find a restaurant and set up shop and learn the culture of a new place. And I kept cooking and working in restaurants until I exhausted all the good restaurants in Canada. It's a big country, but it's actually a little country, not that many people. And I wrote a cover letter to Noma because I wanted to go a little bit beyond. And by this point, I'd probably been cooking for 10 years in really fantastic restaurants up north. And Noma got back to me pretty quickly and said, "Come on over." I wrote them a really long cover letter. I wrote them about my love of sciences. I wrote them about, you know, the fact that I could run a kitchen and I was organized, and I just sold myself. And they said, "Why not? We'll bring you over. You sound crazy enough to work here." And I did that, and I got my ass kicked. Noma is not an easy restaurant to work in. Everything I knew, I had to throw out the window and unlearn. Stepping into those doors and kind of being shocked the first time I saw Ramirez, I'd be even more shocked the first time I saw him yell at someone because something wasn't right. It is a completely different place, and I can't emphasize that enough as a North American cook and understanding North American food culture. To go to Denmark and to see a group of people that from the ground up threw out all the rules and then wrote new ones. I was as inspired by Noma as anyone in this room was before I started working there and got to be a part of it. And you really did have to, you know, your recipe for a bechamel was useless. Your recipe for a sponge cake was useless. And all these things that you learned and had under your belt meant nothing in this restaurant because they built their own vocabulary and they built their own way of working with food and seeing the natural world. And yes, it took the ability to have knife skills or the ability to organize yourself or the ability to run around a kitchen and get the job done to be able to work there. But this whole repertoire of classical cuisine meant nothing. And you kind of had to survive on your wits alone. And that I came into the restaurant at the moment where they were number 2, so they were number 1 in the world for 3 years in a row, and then they lost it, and that's when I came in. And as soon as I started, we won it back, so I was like, I did nothing. I contributed in no way to that win. But it was an amazing time in the restaurant's history. That was 2014. And And I slaved away, and I was on the cold section, and you know, I'd get yelled at by the chef de cuisine, Dan Giusti, when I was brigade, and was doing an amazing thing in school restaurant programs on the East Coast. I get yelled at by the sous chefs, who now have all have amazing restaurants of their own in Copenhagen and elsewhere in the world. But I survived. I would scrape by every day on 4 hours of sleep, and I managed to stay in there. I think it was the Saturday night projects that maybe caught Renee's attention. Saturday night projects were a thing that you would do as a cook at Noma. And it was Renee's way of feeding creativity back into the restaurant. It was Renee's way of giving chefs something more than just robotic mise en place to do, and actually kind of inspiring people to come up with their own ideas. Sometimes you would see chefs try to ferment things themselves. At that point, the fermentation lab, which had spun off from the Nordic Food Lab, was in a box of shipping containers outside in our parking lot, run by Lars Williams and Ariel Johnson. And my Saturday night projects were very un-Noma. They were always intellectual and full of philosophical underpinnings and questions like the subjectivity of taste or what it meant to synthesize flavor. And I was just trying to be me. I was just trying to do what I knew how to do, which is be myself and to talk about the things that I love talking about and learning about. And shortly after a few of these projects, I was sat down and I thought I was getting reprimanded or like, we can't keep you downstairs, you're getting kicked out of service. And they actually sat me down and gave me a promotion and said, we'd love for you to work in the lab. There's an opening over there, Lars needs a hand doing all the production and just keeping stock and organizing and everything. Out of anyone in this restaurant, you'd probably understand it the best. Before that moment, I had no explicit interest in fermentation. I had made kimchi in the first restaurant I worked at in Toronto, which was an Asian joint. I'd made sauerkraut for the adjoined cafes, the place that I worked in Vancouver. But it all felt like recipes. I didn't ask why these things took place, and I didn't really care to know more. You just did it. You followed the recipe. You shredded your cabbage. You added your salt. You left it in a bucket in a corner. You came back, and it tasted right, and you could add it to your room. It was a recipe. But in starting in the fermentation lab at Noma, you had to, again, throw out all your preconceptions about what the world of food, what the rules were, and what that all meant. At Noma, fermentation is a tool that came from the same fermentation revivalism that we've all experienced over the last 10 years, 15 years. Seeing Sandor release his 2 books that really kind of ignited this fire that sparks a bug in all of us. But at Noma, they go beyond that. At Noma for me is a restaurant that is primarily about consideration. And anything that Noma does, you can say that we've considered every aspect of all of those things and decided, okay, this is what we're going to do and this is what we're going to say. When you consider the edible world, when you consider that word, edibility, Noma does that in spades. It looks to the natural world and say, what are people eating or what are they not eating? What is the entire spectrum of things that you could eat? And then it takes some very serious decisions about that and says, okay, well, we're going to forage for our food. We're going to go out into nature and we're going to find things that people have traditionally ignored because these things are edible. They've just been forgotten. And that was one of the first things that sparked the fermentation program at Noma, was the Nordic Food Lab's research into edibility and then into preservation, the salting of capers, making some very simple Nordic preserves that eventually went wrong, became accidentally undersalted, and fermented. And that was the initial spark that lit that whole fire. And in the fermentation lab, when I started, that spirit was well underway. Lars and Ariel had done an amazing job building a program out of every avenue of fermentation you can imagine. Okay, let's make fish sauce. What does that mean to make fish sauce? What is it? It's the enzymatic degradation of proteins at the hands of an animal's own enzymes. It's autolysis. What else can we autolyze? Does it just have to be sardines? Does it just have to be mackerel? No, can it be beef? It could be beef. But we can't use the beef's own guts. That might make people sick. So where do we find the same enzymes in nature? Oh, we can find it in koji, which is on that table over there. There's proteolytic enzymes in fungi. We can apply that to animal meats and make a super umami-rich sauce. And that line of thinking permeated everything that the restaurant did. In the same way that working with wild foods was a consideration of everything that was edible in the natural world, left to its own devices, fermentation allowed Noma to kind of ask that same question about everything that humans do. What can humans do to make food edible? What can humans do to make food last and to make food delicious? And to add manifold more facets to the flavors within Scandinavia's small pantry of native ingredients. And that's what fermentation is at Noma. It's a way of magnifying the natural world and exploring a world of flavors that wouldn't normally be accessible. You know, you can take everything that grows in above the Arctic Circle and say, okay, this is what's on offer. You can think about ways to process that, about ways to cook it. But when you think about ways to ferment it, all of a sudden, every ingredient, a cloudberry, a wild little Arctic berry that can't be grown in agriculture, it has to be forested in the wild in very specific conditions. A cloudberry can just be more than a berry. It's not just a jam anymore. It can become a lacto-fermented fruit. You can take its juice and turn that into an alcohol, and then turn that into a vinegar, or into a kombucha, and they all have different flavors. You can take its juice and lacto-ferment it. You can add salt to it, and end up with almost like a kvass-like thing. You can take the pulp and mix it with koji and make a fruity shio koji. You can dehydrate the pulp and mix it into miso. And all of a sudden, every single ingredient that you have at your disposal, within that pantry of knowledge that you understand from going out into the world, going out into the field for foraging, becomes an infinity of rabbit holes to explore. And that's what Noma does with fermentation. That's why it's so exciting. And that's why Noma is such an amazing restaurant. In his old age, no, Renee's not that old, he's only 41. But in the restaurant's kind of maturing, now that it's 15 years old, the food has almost become to look far simpler. Almost like dubiously simple. Sometimes you only see one ingredient on a plate and that's it. It's a beautiful piece of ceramic. It obviously looks like a perfectly crafted pepper. But what people don't understand about seeing these photos of Noma's food on Instagram is that if you were to put it in your mouth, that one bite, that one simple visual cue that you're about to eat something is an explosion, a fireworks display of different flavors, many of which come from Noma's fermentation lab at the hands of myself and my team. Renee counts on us to give the restaurant, using these ideals, using this consideration and exploration, a world of flavors that no other restaurant on earth can touch. And that's why he really does believe that we are kind of a cut above, and I do too. Everyone who works there knows the hard work that goes into making Noma's food what it is, which is world-class in a way that is completely exploratory. It is boundary pushing. And it is this incessant need to just know a little bit more, to push a little bit further. And that's why fermentation fits so well into Noma's kind of ethos, if you will, and philosophy. It allows us to do all those things in spades. Hi everyone. It really allows us to kind of to make this world of flavor possible. When I started fermenting in the lab, you know, I read a lot of science books in my own spare time. I love learning. That is my passion. It all started with a book on language, probably when I was about 22 years old, called Through the Language Glass, about how language shapes your worldview. And it went from there. So, you know, the sparks went off and I kept thirsting for knowledge. I'm like, oh, well, if language can do this, what's the history of English? That's a super popular. And then you start reading about English, and then you start reading about geography, and you start reading about the tectonic plates, and you start reading about the atmosphere, and then it all just spindles off. It's a really great way to spend your time, reading books about explaining the world. And that's why I was put into the lab at all, because I had the ability to explain things that maybe other chefs couldn't. And Lars and Ariel didn't need to train me so much. They might drop a hint. They might say, oh, koji doesn't just make amylase, it also has protease. And without them needing to explain what a protease was, I was like, oh, ase is an enzyme, that's like a protein dismantling. I'm like, yeah. I'm like, oh, that's why we put it on our ducks, to make them tender. And they're like, yeah, you catch on quick. But if you start reading about fermentation, you start understanding it, you'll make these links yourself. And that's the best part. It's not just about the traditional recipes. I mean, fermentation is great for all those reasons. Fermentation is great for all the Japanese recipes that have been handed down generation after generation to make something such a well-defined craft and such a well-defined way of understanding, honing in on traditional flavors of a region. Same thing for Italian sausages or French wines. That's what fermentation has traditionally been amazing at, is keeping these ideas pure, keeping the cultural heritage of a place alive through recipes, through culture. But if you start to understand it at the scientific level, fermentation is power. There's so much knowledge into how these microbes do everything they do. And once you start to pick that apart, you end up with an explanatory power that lets you really kind of just shape the world however you want it to be. One of the best parts of my job isn't just making all the stuff. That is extremely satisfying. And Noma does make a lot of fermented products. Other restaurants might buy, cases of chicken bones to make chicken stock as the basis for all their soups or sauces or glazes. At Noma, we don't order chicken bones. We order peas by, the hundreds of kilos, and we probably make about 450 kilos of our base piso a year. Why? Because that's what the cooks use to make their stocks. A recipe for a glaze at Noma might look like, a kilo of kombu seaweed, a few hundred grams each of dried ceps, dried morels, and dried bark trumpets, a spoonful of freeze-dried lingonberries, and then a few cups of miso, all boiled together for days. And that finished resultant broth is this amazing thing that can then be reduced or lacquered onto fish or ducks on the barbecue. And you see the power of how all this flavor pours out of the restaurant. So that is an amazing part of my job, is to actually be able to produce these things. But every ingredient at Noma that comes out of the lab, that is part of Noma's catalog of flavors, part of all of the pigments that we use to paint the picture of a 20-course meal, every single one of those things was an experiment in the mind of a chef at one point in time. And there's been a long litany of chefs at Noma who've participated in making the fermentation program what it is today. But it always starts as an experiment. And even if you go back in history, every amazing Japanese miso or French wine or cheese is at some point someone trying something out for the first time or noticing something that went wrong and then doubling down on it. And that's the cool part about fermentation, is that when you start to understand it, you don't have to wait for the accidents. You can make those accidents happen on purpose. And you can keep exploring, and you can keep investigating, and you can keep trying to make new things. Everyone talks about fermentation as if it's like a subset of gastronomy, or at least in the world of cooking in restaurants. That's how people see it. Much in the way that molecular gastronomy in the early 2000s was kind of a neat trick that you could keep in your back pocket. If you were a hot new restaurant on the block and you were making spheres and no one else could, you'd get a lot of attention. But at the end of the day, the sphere is just a party favor. Whatever the sphere actually encases is just another recipe, is just another combination of ingredients. And beyond the initial surprise of seeing that sphere for the first time, once you've seen one, you've seen them all. But you cannot say that once you've tasted a miso, you've tasted all misos. That is not applicable. Or soy sauces, or vinegars, or kombuchas, or ginger bugs. It really is an endless world. It's not a subset of gastronomy. It is this entire mirror universe. Anything you could cook, any way you could think of fermenting, any way if you could think of cooking a piece of salmon, you can find at least as many ways of fermenting it. Do you grill it on the barbecue? Do you grill it on the barbecue and glaze it before you turn it into a fish sauce? Do you poach it? Do you make a dried salmon katsuobushi and then make a stock with that? And then ferment that into a vinegar? So you see that, it's equal. And it was, like Michael Pollan says, the first fire. It was humanity's first way of safe food preservation beyond just drying things out. Beyond just desiccating things or taking them with you or making jerky and hoping that a bear didn't come up and snatch it from your camp. Fermentation allowed society to evolve and flourish by building a cache, by building a bank of nutritious foods that would keep us alive over the course of not just a winter, sometimes entire migrations, or ways to keep a harvest actually available for consumption, to feed families, to feed whole villages, to feed tribes and nation states. John Ciardi has this quote from an old poem of his, that fermentation and civilization are inseparable. And I truly, truly believe that. There isn't a culture on Earth that doesn't ferment. And that's a really powerful notion to take in. From Aborigines in Australia and Papua New Guinea, to Native Indians in Peru, to the Inuit in northern Canada, to the Faroese settlers who ferment their sheep or puffins. Everywhere around the world, people ferment. It is absolutely inseparable. And the pack in between microbes and the people that put them to work is one that goes back through time into the eons. I wish I'd brought a laptop with me so I could show you a funny video, but for the book tour that happened almost a year ago, Renee had the cute idea to open with some old footage of a nature documentary from like the 70s, this old British man narrating, and 16mm footage of animals in the African savannah, all gorging on rotting marula fruit, getting drunk in the process, and it's better than animals doing things on Instagram to watch this. But it does just go to show you, well, if these animals, if these elephants and giraffes and rhesus monkeys can all eat these fruit and enjoy it and seek it out and understand that there's something different about this fruit than other fruits, then of course we've been doing it for just as long. Of course we have. Fermentation has no beginning. And this is something that Sandor says, is that every anthropological history student that talks about the birth of fermentation happening maybe 8,500 years ago, and we find records of that in the archaeological datings of old urns that were used to house wine. We can still see the chemical stains on them. That wasn't the first instance of fermentation in human history, that was the first instance of pottery. Fermentation is a much older practice. We just had to wait for the rest of our technologies to catch up so that there could be a record. And that's a really fascinating thing to think about. It is absolutely a part of us. Before, to correct you, Liz, I didn't come from Copenhagen. I was just in Ireland. I was just in Ireland at a symposium for research into the human microbiome. And that was powerful. It was a room full of doctors, 300 PhDs, people pushing the boundaries of understanding this field. And there might be, the funny thing about science and the natural world is that science takes all its cues from the natural world. It doesn't exist as a body of knowledge somewhere separately in a giant glass laboratory or tower. All doctors, all scientists, all researchers have to look to the natural world to understand it and then make sense of it and really quantify it in a rigorous way to make sure that what they're doing is accurate and correct. And the understanding, or the current understanding of what these microbes actually mean to us. All the microbes in this room responsible for everything from a kombucha to the egg yurt. I've never seen that before. To the kojis, to the sauerkrauts. All these microbes that surround us are so important to us. And they go back much further than our ability to understand that fermented fruit was even a thing. All living organisms, all animals on Earth have microbiomes that not even aid in their survival are absolutely essential to it. And the fact that humans have this whole cachet of cultural technologies where we can put those microbes to work, where we can make them in an extra way a part of our environment by putting them into our food, by keeping them around us, by ensuring that they allow us to stay alive, by keeping our food safe. It's really powerful. Some of the things I wrote in the Gnoma Guide to Fermentation, some things are like one-off lines where I just kind of drop a fact that required me to research for a day or two, pulling out papers from researchers all around the world. And one of the most bolstering and interesting things that I read, even though it isn't necessarily included in the book, are cultures in places like Korea or the Caucasus Mountains. Really heavy fermenting cultures where people do this stuff every day. It's just part of their lives. Where they wake up in the morning, milk their cow, and put their yogurt on. Where they go into the fields, pick wildflowers, come back and throw it into salt brine. And almost everything they eat is fermented. These people have some of the most diverse and healthy microbiota communities living inside them out of anyone on Earth. And even though a lot of evidence shows that, yes, if you have a prebiotic a probiotic drink like a kombucha or even a cup of yogurt, that actually not many of those bacteria responsible for making those fermented goods actually end up staying inside. Lots of them just kind of pass on through. In your average cup of fermented food, let's say a cup of yogurt, 150 mils of yogurt, there might be 10 or 20 billion bacteria. That's a lot. But inside you, there's 100 trillion. That's 1,000 times more. If you think about what a milliliter, a drop from a pipette, looks like in a container or a quart of milk compared to that whole thing of milk being spilled onto a table, that's obviously a big difference. But research does show that by eating fermented foods, you're not just supplying your body with healthy ingredients, you're also supplying all the microbes inside you with food that's already been broken down by microbes. When you eat fermented foods, you're not just eating something that's healthier for you because that act of digestion has been outsourced, because you've made a flight of chemicals, because you've broken down cellulose and turned it into more easily digestible nutrients. It's not just about you, it's also about all of the things that live inside you. And they get as much out of it as you do. And even though science can't really explain it, it's something that we intuitively know in this room, that you feel better when you eat a diet full of fermented leafy greens, things like sauerkraut, yogurts and misos. And when you have these things on a regular basis, you can tell that something's working in your favor. And there's more wild claims about kombucha than I care to mention. But for all the misinformation, there is some kernel of knowledge that just comes down to common sense. That these microbes that are responsible for all the delicious things you see in this room are in some way inherently good for us. And I love that idea. I love the idea that life is a lot grander and a lot more intricately put together than we somehow have it to, than we're somehow led to believe. I grew up in Toronto, in a metropolis in the 80s and 90s. I grew up with a mom who was only too happy to buy Lysol spray when she prepped a chicken dinner to kill 99.9% of the germs that might have been left on the counter. I grew up with germ warfare. And I grew up with a pretty sterile environment. I mean, my mom was from the Caribbean, so cooking was cooking, but I grew up with the sense that, germs were bad. And now we're going from germophobia to germophilia. But I do appreciate the fact that people are beginning to understand that, okay, most of the bacteria out there in the world, most of the microbes are actually harmless. And there's only a few bad eggs. Well, there are some very bad eggs, but in the grand scheme of things, there's a very narrow class of microbial organisms that'll actually do you harm. Most of them are benign. It's in their benefit to be benign. And in their indifference to you, they help you. They protect you by just taking up space. If you were to put 200 friendly, amicable people in this room, and one serial killer in, and he was after someone on the other end, he'd probably have a pretty hard time getting there because there'd just be a lot of people in his way, and hopefully those people would actually kick him out. That's how it works for microbes too. The benign microbes in your world, the benign microbes, or even the helpful ones that actually help to make your food, are just there to displace the bad ones. And by growing up in our Western world with refrigeration, with companies that have taken the ability to ferment out of the hands of normal people and said, you're too busy to cook, let us do it for you. You're too busy to make this stuff, let's buy it from the shelf in a supermarket, pasteurized and ready to go and last for years. By trending towards this in the Western world, we've gotten away from the very thing that got us here at all, which is the ability to make our own food and to take the power of the natural world and use it in our favor. And I kind of believe that companies are coming around to that they're seeing people like everyone in this room, small companies that are doing it out of their home kitchens because they believe in it, because they love it. And are waking up to the fact that this isn't something that can be kept away from the hands of people who really want to do it. I think fermentation is undergoing an amazing and beautiful understanding. Like I said, the revivalism that Sandor might have started 10 or 15 years ago is something that's actually incredibly powerful, and I really don't think it's a trend. I don't think that fermentation in fine dining restaurants is the same thing as molecular gastronomy. That came and went. People saw it, they put it on plates, and then it got old fast. This can't get old, it already is old. It's really old. And if there's more of it on your plates in the restaurant, well, guess what? Then your food's only going to taste better. There's nothing I love more as a practice in understanding the power of fermentation than feeding my interns, when we make miso, on miso making day, a spoonful of everything that goes in. It's like the worst hummus imaginable. It's like slightly chalky peas, the koji, and salt. And then like, ugh. And then having them taste it 3 months later at the end of their internship when they pull it off, and seeing their face light up, and seeing the complexity of flavors that was put there by yeast, and lactic acid bacteria, and acetic acid bacteria, and the enzymes of the koji, and the slow caramelization of patience and time, turn this very banal tasting mixture into something absolutely extraordinary. That's the magic of fermentation. It's transformation. It's an investment into the future. In today's day and age, with a society of instant gratification, where you can get anything in a minute, where you can send an image to space and have it end up in Tokyo like that, and get a like or a happy face back. Fermentation is slow. It forces you to invest in something. It forces you to be connected to something. It forces you to care about something, to peek into the jar, to scrape away the mold, to see how it's tasting, to dip your pinky finger in, to get your kids involved, to get them invested in something. That's slow, that they need to be patient for. To feel the joy of opening it up and actually putting it onto a plate of food and sharing it and breaking bread, and then taking a little bit of that culture and giving it to your neighbor or your friend. That's the beauty of fermentation to me. And that's why I think of it as culture and culture. It's a beautiful coincidence that these synonyms mean what they mean. But that a bacterial culture, the literal division of DNA and genetic information, and the proliferation of a species through a medium, like Lactobacillus plantarum through a vat of sauerkraut, or like Aspergillus oryzae through a bed of rice. The culturing of a microorganism can only happen if culture spreads the same way. If someone with a batch of this thing talks about how good it tastes, talks about how much it makes them happy, talks about all the things they made with it and all the dinners that tasted so amazing for using it, and then gives a little back to a friend. Everyone always asks, hey Dave, how can I make kombucha? I don't have kombucha. And I'm like, you have to go find someone with kombucha. Sorry, you want a golden retriever puppy for Christmas? You gotta go find a golden retriever mom. It's the same thing for bacteria. I hate the word spontaneous fermentation, because it's not true. Spontaneous makes it really feel like it came out of thin air, but those bacteria are literally in the air, floating on molecules of dust, being brushed off your skin. They surround us. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old. Life's been around for like 4 billion years. And life's been nothing but microbial for like 3 billion years. That's a lot of time on Earth. And everything that we consider to be alive in the living world. You look out into the gorgeous mountains of Oregon and the pine forest, and you look at all the people in the streets and all the birds and pigeons flying through the city. Everything you consider to be life, all that multicellularity is a drop in the bucket in the face of the amount, the sheer weight, and the diversity of the microbial world. And this is what's so exciting about fermentation today, and this turning point. And in addition to that, the turning point that science is taking in understanding just what these microbes mean to us and mean to the world at large. There's an estimated 1 trillion different species, 1,000 billion different species of microbes on this planet. Maybe 150,000 of those are well known to science. That's insane to think about. Because that means for everything that makes everything in this room taste as good as it does, for the apricot and honeysuckle you get out of koji, for the tartness and brightness you get out of lactobacilli at the hands of all your lactoferments and pickles, to the deep umami you get from enzymes breaking down a miso, that's just a drop in the bucket in the face of everything that could possibly exist, out of all the microbes that are out there that just haven't been found yet. Big pharmaceutical companies have huge research budgets and can send whole teams of people into the Amazon rainforest to find that rare herb that might have anti-carcinogenic properties. But who's doing that for fermentation? Who's doing that for the food that we feed ourselves? Who's doing that to create the next new amazing flavor? Unfortunately, I don't think there's a company out there putting that sort of work in. But there are a lot of people who are catching the bug. There are a lot of people who want to explore. There are a lot of people who are willing to kind of go down these murky paths and figure out how to make cordyceps edible, or figure out what new strain of aspergillus has been forgotten about for hundreds of years, only waiting to be rediscovered in some corner far off in the south of Japan. And that's the exciting thing for me, that there's still so much work to be done. There's an infinite amount of work to be done. The democratization of fermentation, by just teaching people about it, by being excited about it, by teaching a child how to ferment. I met a guy in Germany who had started a fermentation program at his local kindergarten. A chef. And he said, I'm doing this so that they don't grow up without the knowledge of my grandmother before she dies. That's culture. That's taking a little bit of something and making it a lot. And it should start young. Fermentation is traditionally something that's been done in homesteads. Like the women in Georgia off the side of a road who just have a shack that's a kitchen and a bed and all the things they need to keep themselves alive. And it feels really weird that, you know, it gets conglomerized and built up into the stainless steel vats of very, very large corporations that make most of their money selling the cheapest versions of things to as many people as possible. It does not benefit Budweiser to have craft brewers pop up in every corner of every city, but it does benefit everyone who lives in cities. Why? Because you're never bored. Because you can go out once on the weekend to a new brewery and taste new beers. You can explore, you can figure out what tastes good to you. But it's not just craft brewing, it's everything. It can be a miso soup made from whatever pea grows where you are. It could be a soy sauce made from the same things. It could be a yogurt or some other cultured dairy product, cheeses. The more variety we have, the better. And that's not just for our own entertainment, but the world is changing beneath our feet. We are going to be faced with some very interesting challenges in the next 100 years as a species. And I can't think of a better way to be well prepared for that than knowing what to do in a worst case scenario. Just entertaining the thought. Even if, by the grace of some miraculous deus ex machina, we continue on and invent fusion energy and the world carries on and we're all prosperous and can go on vacation once a year, great. Hopefully. But I'd like to at least be able to know that if the power went out for a week, that I could take whatever was in my fridge and keep it good. That's not so much to ask. That should be taught in high school. It really should. And the more people that know how to ferment, that know how to make their own food, that know how to make food last, the better. Because all of a sudden, the food system isn't aggregated into one central node by a handful of people that are trying to squeeze every last penny out of it. It's decentralized, and it sits within everyone who just knows how to do this stuff. And a decentralized network is a robust network. A network of people who can get together, who can turn food into delicious and tasty food that's safe to keep around for a long time, is a group of people who will go far together. They will culture and keep their culture alive for that reason. And I love that thought. Well, I've meandered for about 40 minutes. There is some Q&A that I'm sure people would love to have. I didn't know what I was going to talk about tonight, but I think I talked about most of what I wanted to talk about.
Amazing. I want you to keep talking forever. People have questions.
People have questions. So, You don't have to ask me questions about all the stuff I said tonight. You can, but if you also have technical questions, I'm also pretty good at answering that too.
Do you want me to do the Q&A, or you just want to do it?
Yeah. No, I think I can see everyone.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. If people have questions or want to raise their hand, I'll just pick you and just stand up and shout it out. Yes, you with the glasses. Hi.
Hi. So, working in a sort of industrial kitchen, you're doing everything in stainless steel and vacuum packing and everything. Is there anything you found that really just worked way better in the traditional clay or wood or whatever?
I love fermenting in wood because it gives its flavor to your food. Yes, we use just food-safe plastic bucket. I mean, they're reusable. We've had them for years, and they work very well. Some stuff I do in glass. There is a lot of stuff that we do in cans and glasses. I always make yogurt in glass. Well, not always. But no, I don't notice that big of a difference. I really don't. Some stuff we do. We try and use as much reusable stuff as possible. So even though we show vacuum bags in the book, like, oh, this is how you can ferment plums. When we do it in big batches, just it saves us time to just do it in a big reusable container with an airlock. But it is nice to show a small restaurant how they can do a small batch really, really precisely. But I don't notice that much difference, if any, honestly, in between doing it in a glass jar versus like a food-safe plastic bucket. Yes, with the green hat. Hi.
Have you picked up the bad habit of yelling at people in your kitchen?
No, I've gotten rid of it.
Thank you.
I don't yell. You know what happens when someone comes to me and they're like, "Hey, I broke this," or like, "Hey, this recipe got messed up." I just look at them very soberly and say, "Did you think about this happening before it happened?" To which they respond, "No, of course not." I'm like, "That's why it happened." And they feel terrible afterwards. What was, repeat the question? That last one, she asked, have I picked up the bad habit of yelling at people in kitchens? No, but also, I mean, fermentation, you yell at someone when you want something immediately, and that doesn't work with this, it doesn't fly. I have to work with the kitchen, and sometimes they'll come to me and be like, "Oh, I didn't send you enough of the pot," like we were doing moldy egg yolks this past season. He's like, "I didn't send you enough of the egg yolks, we need to get some on for tomorrow." I'm like, "No, we don't." We can't. So there's no cheating Mother Nature. So that also it makes you a little bit more zen, because it's not immediate. There's no recourse. If something gets messed up, screaming at someone's not going to make it grow faster. Yeah. Hi.
Hi. So I make kombucha, and until I saw your cookbook, made it mostly with tea. And so
Yeah.
it's very surprising for methods of kombucha.
You can make kombucha out of a lot of stuff. Yes, you can.
Did you come up with that?
No, I mean, not. I've definitely taken it in a lot of different directions since I started in the lab. But no, very early on, Lars Williams was making kombucha from all sorts of different juices. I think the first one was something that him and Renee and Thomas Friebel did in the old houseboat, and it was carrot kombucha, like carrot juice, which is delicious. And it's really fun to make. This summer we were messing around with making kombucha from baby corn, which has really high contents of sorbitol, which is it's a saccharine molecule. It's a sweet tasting molecule, but it's not sugar, so it's unfermentable by yeast and bacteria. So it just sits there, and then you have this sour thing that's also like artificially sweet, but in a pleasant way, like licorice. So yeah, there's a lot of different things that you can make kombucha from. And if someone tells you can't, they're wrong.
I will say the only mold issue I've ever had was with the coffee one.
Really? Okay.
But that could have been the environment.
It could have. It could have. That's one that works almost flawlessly for us all the time, I gotta say. Yes. Hi.
Hi. Similar kind of mold question. I did the plums and also the tomatoes from the cookbook, and I did it in a crock, and it was under the glass, and I just got so much mold, and I think I'm a bit confused because I'm used to doing things in a salt brine and it's submerged, but in this case it's this fruit juicy.
Yeah.
What do you do differently that I'm not?
I can't, we never get mold. I don't know, we very rarely. Yeah, if it doesn't get juicy enough. So something that I see people doing on Instagram, if they like tag me and they're like, oh, I made the fermented plums, and they do it under a weight, is that they don't chop the plums up fine enough. Sometimes they half it, like it's shown in the like the vacuum bag version. But in the book I say, okay, cut it into smaller pieces so there's less air in between each piece of fruit and more surface area for liquid to be drawn out of.
It's kind of juice.
Okay, but it still got moldy, and it was under ceramic.
Yeah, and I wonder if maybe the airlock is the way to go, or the...
Yeah, also the size of your vessel. This is something I tell my guys in the lab as well a lot, is that if you have like a big bucket, but you only have like 10% of that space filled up, even though it's underweight, even though it might make juice, that's a lot of oxygen in its environment. So if you find a properly sized fermenting vessel for the amount of vegetable matter you're looking to ferment, that'll help, because as soon as the oxygen's out of that environment, the sooner the oxygen's out of that environment, the less chance it has to be exposed to mold. If it takes 2 days to get, mold to grow, in a standard at room temperature, if all the oxygen's out of there before then, just by the gases being produced, then you've made that environment safe and mold-free.
So like the air...
Yeah.
If it was on, if there was a lid and it had the water seal...
Yeah.
Okay, less space.
Less space, less head space. Less head space, less oxygen, less chance for mold to grow. Yes, in the back.
So we're all used to like taking a little bit of a fermentation to put in the next batch to keep it going. But
Yeah.
what would you recommend to like find new of the trillion bacteria to find new ones? What kind of process would you recommend for that?
Yeah, to be honest, you would need like a microbiology lab to make sure that, at the end of the day you do. Or you just need to go to you just need to keep exploring. Because, every time I go and visit like a fermenter in a different country, you find something new. You find something where you're like, what's this? Or like, how do you make that? Or what's this flavor? And it is some lineage of things that have been kept alive. At the end of the day, to know that there's a new microbe that produces a new metabolite that would be safe to use and then kind of grow that en masse, you would need a lab to just make sure that the thing was safe to eat. I guess another question I get all the time is like, oh, how can I culture my own aspergillus? And I'm like, do not. Don't do that, you'll kill yourself. Because you can't take aspergillus out of the wild. You can't culture it, you can breed it, but you have no way of knowing for sure that that's 100% safe to eat. At Noma, when we do kind of veer off the beaten path and try and grow things on not normal substrates, we do send it off to a lab to just make sure that aflatoxins haven't popped up. Because sometimes genes, like the gene that makes koji safe to eat, but Aspergillus niger makes you sick, it's just a gene that's turned off. It's still in koji. So you do have to be aware that you're not causing some sort of environmental factor or some sort of phenotypic factor to spring up where that gene would ever be turned back on. So yes, we do need to keep exploring. There is a ton of stuff out there that's never been discovered. But it's also important to keep safety in mind and to just put the work into research and double check.
So David, I think we have time for one more question.
One more question. Who has the best question?
Well, I'm sure you can expound on it. I think the world of fermentation we run, maybe 4 to 5 years ago, these flows went on with everything that's out there. If we were walking in the Nova Food Lab versus someone's home versus a commercial kitchen, how sanitary is the food lab? Do you get cross-contamination a lot? What do we need to worry about at home or in restaurants as far as getting different types of bacteria in our ferments?
The lab, we scrub down with soap and hot water. It looks very clean because it's built like a lab and it's full of stainless steel and tiles. Yes, but at the end of the day, we would just wash most things with soap and hot water. And if we need to sanitize something before we're putting a long-term ferment on, we use a little bit of dilute ethanol. That's nothing that you can't find in a grocery store, to be honest. And it works great. Working clean, like the cleanliness that you'd expect from any good restaurant kitchen, counts more than you know, like having the fungicides on hand, or antibacterial sprays, or autoclaves. Just being able to be like, okay, I'm working with this thing, my counter's clean, things aren't spilling into other buckets of stuff, like there isn't, you know, gross things, the vinegar didn't over bubble and like spill out and I haven't cleaned it. It's just like the common sense stuff that makes for a sanitary environment. You give the microbes the right condition and they do most of the heavy lifting for you. You know, you can scrub to the high heavens, but if your lactobacillus isn't acidulating your ferment quickly enough, then yeah, you're going to get mold, you're going to get problems. But just that kind of common sense, just cleanliness, soap, hot water, a bit of ethanol. Germs aren't the enemy, you just want to get them out of the way so you can put what you want to put there. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you everyone for having me.
Out here, he'll be hanging out for a bit, and you can purchase copies of the Noma Guide to Fermentation out from Broadway Books in the hallway. So we're just going to kind of have a line that snakes back that way, because once we all get up from here, we're going to start the tasting, we're going to have the demos starting in about 20 minutes out on the mezzanine, the rooftop is open, but yeah, you can go out there to purchase copies of the books, and let's all put our hands together one more time.
Probably seen
sugar that's been there for a
I'm just worried because there's the husk there, so I probably wouldn't, it's not pearlized.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, then that's
almost gone.
And I also like this. Yes. If this, you may have a lot. What?